Amityville, a small, quiet town on Long Island, New York, where tree-lined streets, white picket fences, and modest homes gave the impression of peace and stability. For decades, it was the image of suburban America, a safe place to raise a family. But on November 13, 1974, Amityville's name would become synonymous with horror. What happened inside the house at 112 Ocean Avenue was so brutal, so shocking, that it not only destroyed a family, but also gave birth to one of the most infamous legends of all time. The DeFeo family lived in that house, Ronald Sr. and Louise, along with their children, Ronald Jr., known as Butch, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John Matthew. From the outside, they looked like the picture of success. Ronald Sr. was a car salesman with a reputation for discipline, Louise a caring mother, and the children, though not perfect, were well regarded in the community. But behind the closed doors of 112 Ocean Avenue, tension brewed. Ronald Sr. was strict, domineering, and often abusive. Butch, the eldest son at 23, bore the brunt of his father's control. He struggled with drugs, with anger, and with resentment that had been building for years. On that cold November night, Butch snapped. Armed with a .35 caliber Marlin rifle, he crept through the darkened halls of his family's home. One by one, he entered the bedrooms where his family slept. First, he shot his father, Ronald Sr., in his bed. Then his mother, Louise. He moved to the children's rooms, Dawn just 18, Allison 13, Mark 12, and John Matthew, only 9 years old. Each was executed with precision, 2 shots for most, all as they lay helpless in their beds. In less than 30 minutes, 6 lives were extinguished, leaving only Butch alive. What puzzled investigators was not just the brutality, but the silence. The rifle had no silencer, yet none of the neighbors reported hearing gunshots. More disturbingly, none of the victims appeared to have stirred. They were all found face down in their beds, as though frozen in their sleep, undisturbed by the noise of murder. No signs of struggle, no attempts to flee. It was as if something had held them down, paralyzed them, allowing Butch to slaughter them without resistance. When the police arrived, the scene was nightmarish. Blood soaked the sheets, walls, and floors. The children's small bodies lay motionless, their innocence forever silenced. Louise was still clutching her pillow, her expression frozen in shock. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air, mingled with the copper tang of blood. Officers who responded to the scene would never forget what they saw inside 112 Ocean Avenue that night. It wasn't just a crime scene, it was a massacre. Butch was arrested almost immediately. At first, he tried to blame the killings on a mob hit, but under pressure, his story unraveled. He eventually confessed to murdering his entire family. Yet even in his confessions, contradictions emerged. At times, he claimed voices in the house had driven him to kill. Other times, he said he acted in self-defense against his abusive father. His accounts shifted with each telling, weaving a web of uncertainty that would fuel speculation for decades. During his trial, the defense argued that Butch was insane, tormented by inner demons, hearing voices that commanded him to kill. The prosecution, however, painted him as a cold-blooded murderer, motivated by resentment and the promise of inheriting his family's wealth. The jury sided with the prosecution. In 1975, Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, where he continued to change his story until his death in 2021. Yet for many, the conviction did not answer the questions. How had 6 people been shot in their beds without any of them waking or fleeing? Why had the neighbors not heard the barrage of gunfire? And what of Butch's claims of hearing voices? Were they the ramblings of a disturbed mind, or something far more sinister? It was these unanswered questions that would open the door for what came next. Because the murders alone were enough to scar Amityville forever. But it was what happened a year later, when a new family moved into the house, that transformed the tragedy into legend. In December of 1975, just a little more than a year after the DeFeo murders, the house at 112 Ocean Avenue stood silent. Its elegant Dutch colonial facade with the quarter-moon windows gave it an almost charming appearance, but the truth was different. For most, the house was tainted. Who would want to live where 6 people had been slaughtered in their beds? Yet for George and Kathy Lutz, newlyweds eager to start a new life with Kathy's 3 children, the house seemed like an opportunity too good to pass up. The Lutzes purchased the home for a price far below market value. They knew its history. Their real estate agent even whispered the details. 6 murders, a family wiped out in a single night. But George and Kathy convinced themselves it was the past. They were not the DeFeos. They would bring love, laughter, and faith into the house. Still, to ease their minds, they invited a Catholic priest to bless the home before moving in. Father Ralph Pecoraro entered the house on a cold December afternoon. As he sprinkled holy water and recited prayers, he claimed he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. In one upstairs bedroom, later identified as the room where Mark and John Matthew DeFeo had been killed, he heard a voice harsh and guttural, commanding him, "Get out." Shaken, the priest fled, warning the family not to use that room as a bedroom. The Lutzes brushed off his warning. They wanted to believe they could make this house their home. On December 18, 1975, the Lutz family moved in. What followed was 28 days of terror that would etch their names into history. At first, the disturbances were subtle. George began to notice a strange chill in the house, even when the fireplaces roared with heat. He became obsessed with chopping wood, feeding fires that never seemed to warm him. Kathy had vivid nightmares about the DeFeo murders, dreams so real she claimed she knew the order in which the family had been killed. The children grew restless, frightened of shadows in their rooms, speaking of voices that whispered to them in the dark. Then came the swarms of flies. In the dead of winter, hundreds appeared in the upstairs rooms, covering windows and buzzing angrily. George and Kathy swatted them away, cleaned, sprayed, but the insects returned again and again. At night, the family heard footsteps pounding in the halls, doors slamming shut, and an unseen force knocking on walls. George's personality began to change. Normally mild-mannered, he grew angry, paranoid, and distant. He spent hours staring into the flames of the fireplace, sharpening an axe, his temper simmering. Friends who visited said he seemed like another man. Kathy, meanwhile, claimed she felt touched by unseen hands, sometimes caressed, sometimes pinned down. On more than one occasion, she said she levitated above her bed, while George lay paralyzed beside her. The children were not spared. Kathy's daughter Missy began speaking to an imaginary friend she called Jody. At first, the parents dismissed it as childhood fantasy, until Missy described Jody as a pig with glowing red eyes. On several nights, George and Kathy swore they saw those eyes shining from outside her bedroom window, staring in from the darkness. Other phenomena grew more terrifying. Green slime oozed from keyholes and walls. Crucifixes hung on the walls were found upside down. Foul odors, sulfur, sewage, decay, drifted through the rooms without explanation. George claimed he woke nightly at exactly 3:15 a.m., the time when Butch DeFeo had carried out the murders. Each time he felt drawn to the boathouse outside, convinced something waited for him there. The tension escalated as the days passed. One night George awoke to see Kathy's face transformed into that of an old, withered woman. Another time, Kathy dreamed of bodies lying in the house, only to wake and find her children sleeping in the same exact positions. Doors ripped from hinges, windows shattered, and mysterious welts appeared on their bodies without cause. By the third week, the family was unraveling. George was nearly catatonic, consumed by anger and obsession. Kathy feared for her children's safety, not only from whatever haunted the house, but from George himself, who seemed under its influence. The children cried nightly, begging to leave. On January 14, 1976, just 28 days after moving in, the Lutz family fled. They left behind furniture, clothing, and personal belongings. They abandoned the house in the middle of the night, never to return. To this day, they refuse to describe the final night in detail, saying only that it was too terrifying to recount. The Lutz's flight transformed the Amityville house from a crime scene into a legend. Newspapers published their story. Paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren visited, declaring the house infested with demonic forces. Skeptics accused the Lutzes of fabrication, claiming they invented the haunting to profit from book and film deals. But believers pointed to the physical evidence, the consistency of their accounts, and the fear in their voices as proof that something truly evil resided at 112 Ocean Avenue. What cannot be denied is this: a family bought a house knowing it carried a dark past. Within less than a month, they abandoned it in terror, never to return. Whether their story was hoax, hysteria, or hell itself, It cemented the reputation of Amityville as the most infamous haunted house in the world. When the Lutz family fled from 112 Ocean Avenue in January of 1976, they left behind more than their belongings. They left behind a story that would ignite a storm of fascination, fear, and controversy. The tale of their 28 days of terror spread quickly, first through local newspapers and then across the nation. What had been the tragic home of a family murder now became the stage for a supernatural legend. The haunting of Amityville had begun to spread. George and Kathy Lutz were reluctant to speak publicly at first. They were shaken, traumatized, and unwilling to relive the nightmare. But word of their flight from the house intrigued reporters, paranormal enthusiasts, and skeptics alike. Soon, their story caught the attention of investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, the famous husband and wife team known for their work with cases of possession and haunting. The Warrens arrived at the Amityville house in February 1976, accompanied by a crew of journalists, photographers, and researchers. From the moment they entered, Lorraine, a self-proclaimed clairvoyant, said she felt an overwhelming presence of evil. She claimed to see dark shadows moving through the rooms, to hear the cries of the DeFeo victims, and to sense a demonic force lurking in the home. Ed performed blessings and attempted to provoke whatever entity remained, convinced the house was a portal of malevolence. The investigation became infamous not only for the Warrens' testimony but for one chilling piece of evidence, a photograph. Captured during their time in the house, it showed what appeared to be the ghostly figure of a young boy peering from a doorway. His eyes glowed white in the flash, his features eerily similar to John Matthew DeFeo, the youngest victim of the murders. Skeptics argued it was a crew member accidentally caught in frame, but believers insisted it was proof that the spirits of the murdered children lingered in Amityville. The story exploded into the mainstream when author J. Anson published the Amityville Horror in 1977. The book, based on 45 hours of interviews with the Lutzes, described in harrowing detail the events of their 28-day stay. It recounted the flies, the slime, the demonic pig named Jody, the violent apparitions, and the family's desperate escape. The book became a bestseller, captivating readers worldwide and cementing Amityville as the ultimate haunted house story. But with fame came doubt. Almost immediately, skeptics began to question the Lutzes' claims. Lawyers involved with Butch DeFeo's trial accused the couple of fabricating the story over drinks, dreaming up a tale that could be spun into profit. Journalists pointed out inconsistencies between the Lutzes' testimony and police records. Paranormal researchers debated whether the phenomena described were exaggerated or entirely invented. Still, others insisted the experiences could not be dismissed so easily. Neighbors reported odd occurrences around the house, such as lights flickering in empty rooms and phantom sounds echoing from within. Visitors after the Lutzes claimed they too felt uneasy, as though the house itself was watching them. For believers, the controversy only added to the mystery. If the haunting was real, then skepticism was just another weapon of the demonic. Hollywood soon entered the picture. In 1979, the Amityville Horror film was released, dramatizing the Lutz family's ordeal with terrifying intensity. Audiences flocked to theaters, and the movie became a massive success. Its iconic image, the haunted house with quarter-moon eye windows glowing in the night, burned itself into the collective imagination. Sequels and remakes followed, each amplifying the legend, each ensuring that Amityville's name would forever be linked to terror. For the Lutz family, the fame was both a blessing and a curse. They profited from their story, but they also endured relentless criticism, accusations of fraud, and the emotional toll of reliving their nightmare again and again. George insisted until his death that the events were real, while Kathy echoed his conviction. Their children, however, gave mixed accounts as adults, some supporting their parents' claims, others dismissing them as exaggerations. The Warrens remained firm in their belief that Amityville was one of the most dangerous cases they ever encountered. Lorraine often described it as a psychic impression of horror, a place soaked in trauma and therefore vulnerable to demonic infestation. Ed warned that the house itself had become a beacon for darkness, a site where evil had taken root. Yet skeptics remained equally firm. Critics argued that no physical evidence of the slime, the levitations, or the red-eyed pig was ever produced. The photo of the ghost boy, they claimed, was nothing more than a mistake. And the timing of the Lutz's story, just as they faced financial difficulties, led many to believe the haunting was nothing more than a clever hoax. The debate only fueled the legend. Each side, believers and skeptics, strengthened the myth by refusing to let it die. Books, documentaries, talk shows, and even late-night radio programs kept the Amityville Horror alive, turning it from a single-family story into a cultural phenomenon. By the 1980s, Amityville was no longer just a house on Long Island. It was a symbol, the ultimate haunted house, the setting of nightmares, the question mark at the center of a nation's obsession with the supernatural. Whether it was real or fabricated almost didn't matter anymore. The story had taken on a life of its own, feeding off fear, belief, and controversy. And yet, beneath all the fame and spectacle, one fact remained undeniable. 6 members of the DeFeo family had been murdered in their beds. That tragedy was real. That blood had soaked into the walls and floors of 112 Ocean Avenue. And whether demons, restless spirits, or human greed were responsible, the house bore a darkness that could not be ignored. The Amityville Horror was no longer just a haunting. It had become a legend that blurred the line between fact and fiction, between crime and curse. And as the story spread around the world, it asked a question that no one could answer with certainty. Was Amityville truly haunted, or was it the greatest ghost story ever told? By the time the 1980s arrived, the Amityville Horror had already crossed the line between haunting and legend. What began with a brutal crime in 1974 and escalated with the Lutz family's 28 days of terror had grown into something much larger, a cultural phenomenon that would haunt imaginations for decades. Amityville was no longer just an address. It was an idea, synonymous with cursed houses, restless spirits, and the fine line between truth and fabrication. The release of Jay Anson's book, The Amityville Horror, in 1977, had propelled the story into the national spotlight, but it was the 1979 film adaptation that burned it into the collective psyche. The film, with its iconic image of the Dutch colonial house with quarter-moon windows glowing like evil eyes, terrified audiences and convinced millions that the Lutz family's ordeal was real. Even those who had never read the book or followed the original news reports recognized the silhouette of the Amityville house. It became a symbol of haunted America, on par with Salem's Witches or the Bell Witch legend in Tennessee. Sequels and spin-offs followed, each adding to the mythology. Some focused on the house itself, others on cursed objects supposedly tied to it. In 2005, a Hollywood remake reintroduced the story to a new generation, blending fact, fiction, and cinematic terror. The line between truth and imagination blurred further with each retelling, but that only seemed to strengthen the legend. For many, the details didn't matter. What mattered was the fear Amityville inspired, the possibility that evil could seep into the very walls of a house, infecting those who lived within it. Meanwhile, debates raged. Skeptics pointed out inconsistencies in the Lutz family's accounts. Investigators noted the lack of physical evidence. No photographs of the slime, no recordings of voices, no proof of levitation or demonic pigs. They highlighted the Lutz's financial struggles, suggesting they had fabricated the story as a way out of debt. Lawsuits erupted over the rights to the story, further muddying the waters. Even some of the Lutz children as adults offered conflicting perspectives, some insisting the haunting was real, others dismissing it as exaggeration, and yet the legend persisted. Why? Perhaps because Amityville touched on something primal, the fear of home turning hostile. A house is supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of safety. But Amityville suggested that even the most ordinary picturesque home could become a trap, a prison of evil. It was a horror not confined to graveyards or castles. It was a horror that could exist next door. Ed and Lorraine Warren, who had investigated the house in 1976, continued to champion the haunting as authentic. Lorraine often described the evil she felt there as unlike anything else in her career. The infamous photograph of the ghostly boy, supposedly captured during their investigation, circulated widely, fueling belief that the spirits of the murdered DeFeo children still roamed the halls. For believers, the Warrens' testimony added credibility. For skeptics, it was more fuel for accusations of hoax. Over time, the house itself became a point of controversy. Subsequent owners reported no paranormal activity, living peacefully without the terrors described by the Lutzes. Some used this as proof that the haunting had been fabricated. Others suggested that the evil had been tied specifically to the Lutz family, feeding off their energy, their vulnerabilities, their fears. A few argued that the rituals performed by priests and investigators may have quieted the entity, sealing it away. Whatever the truth, the house remained infamous, drawing gawkers, tourists, and thrill-seekers who wanted to glimpse the site of America's most famous haunting. The town of Amityville, however, grew weary of the attention. Residents complained of tourists clogging the streets, snapping photos, and disturbing the neighborhood. Over the years, the address of 112 Ocean Avenue was changed, and the distinctive quarter-moon windows were remodeled, in part to discourage curious visitors. Yet no matter how much the facade changed, the legend endured. The word Amityville itself had become a brand, instantly recognizable, impossible to erase.